Hello, everyone, and welcome to our special edition of Bad Work Stories Made Good today, as we welcome in our first ever special guest, Sarah. Welcome to Bad Work Stories Made Good. How are you this evening?
Doing okay. Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here with you.
Fantastic. Well, why is Sarah here? And Sarah is our special guest tonight because we are celebrating this week International Women's Day. And the theme for 2023 is Embrace Equity. And Sarah, I know this is a subject very close to your heart. So why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself and why the subject's so important to you?
Sure thing. Well, let's see. I'm an anthropologist by training and a management consultant by trade. And in my consulting career, so in my training, I've really focused a lot on cultural differences. As an anthropologist, you would expect that. I'm really fascinated by the range of human difference, and also as part of my studies, I studied, a lot about the history of how these human differences were kind of institutionalized, and that plays into our work life today, right? So, and in my management consulting career, I've focused a lot on the employee experience. That's been my big kind of area of intervention. So I worked for many years doing employee engagement surveys, and then more recently, I've been in the diversity and inclusion space. And so, for me, a big issue with equity is just a lack of awareness of how much inequity there still is. On the topic of gender equity, for example, women have made a lot of strides. We've progressed, but there is still a gap within the demographic of women in general. There are gaps, right? So we know that, for example, one of the things that really struck out to me, or like a statistic that always sticks in my mind, is how much diversity and equity efforts over the years have benefited women, but white women only. And so if you look at, for example, just as a way of understanding the situation, if you look at Fortune 500 companies, you'll see that less than 10% of CEOs are women, less than 1% are Black women. And so that's, for me, a glaring situation that persists, and it's something that I think is really important for us to face head on.
Absolutely. So why don't we just, wind back a little bit, and maybe for the benefit of our listeners, and I also, something for myself as well, is what do we actually mean by equity? There's a lot of talk about equality and equity. As I said, the International Women's Day theme is embracing equity. So what does equity actually mean in the situation? And let's take it from there, Sarah.
Yeah, so that's a great question, actually. Define our terms, because a lot of times we talk about things and we're not talking about the same thing, right? So equity is best understood, I think, when contrasted with equality. They're not the same thing. It's kind of like, if you're a parent, you can relate to this example. You got 3 kids, right? They're different ages. They're not the same gender. They're different personalities. They're different, right? There's 3 kids. Yep. And each of those 3 kids has different needs. So how would the kids feel if you bought them all the same clothes, fed them all the same food, even though one has a peanut allergy, sent them all to the same schools, gave them all the same lessons, and treated them exactly the same? It wouldn't benefit them, right? If that's not, you may think you're doing the right thing by treating them exactly the same, but you're not. You're missing out on giving some of them, meeting certain needs that they have because they're different, right? So the difference between equality and equity is equality is more like treating everyone the same, whereas equity is giving everyone what they need. And so in the context of the workforce, that's where all that history plays in. And understanding the history of, say, colonization will help you understand why today there are still these inequities. There's still remnants, right, of old ways of thinking in our work, in our social circles, and therefore in our work life. So equity requires us to often actually treat people differently, and we feel like that's not fair because we're taught to treat everyone the same. We're taught
Yeah, yeah.
that is how you do the right thing, right? You treat everyone the
Mm,
same.
yeah.
And
So,
so it's starting to build this understanding that it's not about treating everyone the same. It's about understanding differences and different needs, and then trying to address those different needs.
and it's amazing how this, like, this the sensitivity, or that really high alert sensitivity in the workforce, because it kind of seems like that example that you gave with the kids, right? Anyone listening to that go, well, there might be some things that are equal, but ultimately we do meet the needs of the kids, from an education perspective, what they're interested in, their passions. And then, just another example out of my own life would be, when you're exercising, or ever been to into a class where your body is different to other people's, and your level of flexibility, or your background, or your knowledge, we make allowances and don't think anything of it in a class,
Right.
right? We
Of
just
course.
go, oh, that person needs some extra help, or that person's getting a prop if you're in yoga, or the instructor's giving a little bit more attention to this person because they want the correct alignment. We think nothing of it, right, in those situations. But in the workplace, it's like high alert, danger, danger, this is unfair, and we get into that fear piece. Is that a reflection, Sarah?
Absolutely. There's a fear of preferential treatment, right? And there's
Right.
a fear that someone is going to be treated unfairly if, so for example, one thing I've heard a lot in the diversity and inclusion space is marginalized identity groups, for lack of a better term, like LGBTQ plus community, Black folks. A lot of times there's the feeling that the diversity efforts are focusing more on the other group than on mine. It's like, oh, well,
Right.
we're only talking about the LGBTQ. We're not talking about racism. A lot of times it's true in the sense that of all of the marginalized identity groups, the one that people like least talking about is race. It's very uncomfortable for people.
Mm,
At least that's in my experience. That's not a scientific fact, right? That's just my observation.
mm.
So there's
So
this
how do
sense that, go ahead.
no, go finish. Yeah, sorry.
There's this sense that we have to fight for the airtime, right, to talk about our issues, and that um, and so anytime you're paying attention to one group in particular, it feels unfair because it feels like you're excluding the other groups. So that's a phenomenon that we have to continually contend with. And the way we do that is by saying, sometimes in order to understand a community, we got to go deep into that community and really understand what their particular issues are.
Mm.
Um, and
Yeah.
and how do you solve a problem? You got to focus on that problem, right? You can't just focus on the idea of problems in general, right? You have to get
And I think
specific.
something else that you raised earlier is going back, because it's not, and maybe this is, we can get into ways that we can make this good, because, on this podcast, we talk about, okay, so here's the bad work story, right? We have lack of equity. We have, you raised the example there of the gender inequity. So how do we make this good, Sarah? So if you can take us through, like, an example where how do we actually do something practical and that's accessible to us to make this story. If we can't make it good, then at least we can make it better or relieve some of the suffering involved. What do you say?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we have to do something, and we can't solve, you know, 500 years of history in, one podcast. But what we
Mm,
can do is be aware of the things that we can do as individuals. So I like to think of it on the three levels of, me, my
mhm,
relationships with other people, and then the system that I work in. And I can influence all of those things, right? I can influence myself. And so it's an opportunity, right, to do that, to look at ourselves and to be really honest and say, how am I contributing to this?
mhm,
Um, so in terms of addressing it, I think that embracing equity, that phrase is really important, because a lot of times we'll say, "Wow, it's not working." I can't do it. But really, it's not about I can't do it. It's that you won't do it most of the time, right? I mean, we know that, and a lot of times we won't do it because it's very uncomfortable or we don't know what to do. And so the first thing, I think, the first area of action is the self. And it's
Mm-hmm.
understanding, first of all, it's admitting, I don't know everything about this. And I'm probably not doing it right. In terms of, if you take the race question in particular, like, why are there no senior Black women in my organization? Ask yourself that
Mm.
question.
Mm.
And you probably have a tendency to say, well, it's not my problem. I didn't do that. That's not my issue. I'm not the person who hires. I'm not the person who does the hiring strategy. I'm not.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And that's not helpful. There is something that you can do, even if it's just changing the way you think about the situation, educating yourself on what's going on out there in the work world. What are the stats? How many Black women do we have in senior positions? What is my organization's strategy on that? Why does it even matter to my organization? You know, I work a lot with companies in the medical devices field, and I can tell you it matters. It matters a lot because you don't have representation at the most basic, or even in advertising. So medical devices, advertising, all kinds of areas where there's no Black woman at the table.
Wow.
And so when you come out to the final product, they're not accounted for. And you have things like the Dove commercial where you have the woman washing herself white. And, I don't know if you remember that, but there's all kinds of things that happen. Yeah. Nobody intended for that to happen. No one said, hey, let's make a commercial that's really racist. It's just, it gets in like our unconscious biases and our lack of understanding of certain things. And then boom, there you have something that's racist that no one intended to be racist.
Exactly.
So,
yeah.
The first area is being is the self, and that really is admitting that you could be implicated, that you could be implicated. And I don't know if you want me to keep going with the other two, or
yes, please. Yeah. And by implicated, just the clarity on what you mean by that. So the meaning I'm involved with the bigger picture, that I'm part of the problem or our blindness, in this case, gender and color blindness.
This isn't my area of saying I have nothing to do with this is not an option.
Right.
Even if it's like, even if it's just like, reading a book about the topic, because you don't know where your implication is going to pop up, where you're going to have an aha moment that says, oh yeah, I do that. For example, I'll give you a personal example. Okay. White women have a tendency, I learned after reading about this, to take up all the space in a room, to be like the moms, where we're like, okay, I know what to do, blah, 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 and sort of tell people. And if you're a white woman working with Black women, you have to be careful of that dynamic, because you can silence your Black women colleagues. And they have another dynamic that they're dealing with, which is stereotype threat, where they're afraid they're not afraid, but they have to constantly manage the perception that other people have of them. And so if you put those two dynamics together, you have a white woman who takes up all the space, who erases the Black woman. And then the Black woman, when she speaks up, she gets stereotyped as the angry Black woman. So when I say implicate myself, what I mean is, it's not enough for me to just know about that dynamic. I have to say, I do this. I have done this before. And I have to look at my behavior and say, yes, I have done that before. And my intention is kind of irrelevant, because the impact is really the bigger thing. And just be humble, be willing to give up your pride, because it's not really about you. And it doesn't mean that you're a terrible person and that you should be branded an outcast. It's not about that. It's more of just where does the system start to change? It starts to change with individuals. Yeah. And so, nothing is ever going to change unless you decide that you're open to change.
So being open, being curious, allowing that form of reflection, and being prepared to be uncomfortable about what you might find, right? Yes. And asking those uncomfortable questions, which I think brings us to the lens number 2, which is interpersonal. Is that right?
Interpersonal, yes. So it's me, and then it's my relationships with other people. And a lot of this stuff is just like, it's relational ethics, is if you want a technical term for it. If you really
break that down for us.
Relational ethics is like about, having ethics in your relationships. It's about having kind of like a moral code for yourself in your relationships
Mhm.
with people. And one of the big parts of relational ethics that is really relevant here is managing your emotional affect. So let's just say, you're in an organization, and let's just say that, you're dealing with interpersonal dynamics with maybe one of the few Black or women of color that's there, and maybe she calls you out on something that you said that, unintentionally, you didn't mean to use coded language or to stereotype, but you did. And then she calls you out and she says, hey, can I give you some feedback on that interaction? What did you mean by this certain thing that? And then you start to get really upset, right? You start to it starts to upset you. You start feeling like you're being attacked. And like, where does she get off telling you how you should be talking? That's where it becomes important. The moment that you start feeling uncomfortable and really attacked and put out, and like, this is inappropriate and what's a big deal, there's your
Mm.
opportunity in that interaction to take a step back and manage your emotions. Because if you can do that, then you can really listen to what that person is saying. If
Mm.
if you're lucky and blessed, then that person will be giving you feedback that's super useful. I know that's happened to me
Yeah,
before
absolutely. Yeah.
when we were having a discussion around it was about racism, and there was Black women in the conversation and white women, and I, being the anthropologist, was like, well, race doesn't really exist, blah, 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 and the Black woman was like, that's not helpful because racism exists and I am a victim of it and I have to
Mm.
deal with this every day. And I was on my high horse. I was like, how dare you tell me that I'm wrong? I know I have a PhD, like, and that's exactly my moment of opportunity to be humble and to be like, my my PhD is completely irrelevant. This woman has a PhD in
Life. Yeah.
being stereotyped her entire life, and I
Mm.
better listen when
Mm.
she says this is.
Mm.
So that's, for
Mm.
me, it comes out of the personal, right? The personal is like, being humble and being willing to accept feedback, being willing to accept that you're wrong, and that feeds into the interpersonal. Same thing. Being humble, being willing to accept that you're wrong, being willing to accept feedback, being willing to as white women also, we're taught to be, we have to be perfect, we have to be good and perfect and nice.
Mm.
And when you're told that you're not good, perfect, or nice, that can make you
Like a
upset.
trigger, yeah. And in this situation, the embarrassment of what you might have set up, or that's like shuts it down. So in the example of the lack of coloured and black women at senior leadership level, what's something that would be a practical go-to in the interpersonal space from your experience?
Well,
Just
this is
having
where
those
the system,
conversations, or
yes, yes, courageous conversations, but that's also where
Hmm.
the systemic comes into play, because
Right.
the
Okay, let's lead into
conversation that,
systemic, yeah, and then we can bring it
yeah,
all together, maybe. Yeah, yeah,
that's
go
where
for it.
you have to. So for culture change in organizations, the interpersonal is super important, obviously, but
Hmm.
you have to have those systems in place to carry it when the people aren't able to carry it. So um,
And to make it safe for people too, right?
make it safe for people, exactly. So in the interpersonal example, um, when you're let's say that it was something about performance management, right? Where someone made a comment, and if it was in that context, then it's that's where the systemic can rise up to kind of hold you, because we can say, well, if we're talking about someone's performance, let's just say that the comment that I made had to do with, black women are this or that, something stereotypical, like she doesn't have gravitas. Okay, that's a common coded language where someone will say,
Oh,
well, that
wow.
person doesn't have gravitas, or they don't have that executive presence, and
That's one. Yeah.
it's code for something else, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, that's when the systemic, we look and we say, okay, well, what are the job competencies? What are the skills at play here? What are the things that we actually need on paper? And let's talk about that. Let's be objective, because usually when evaluating other human beings, we get pretty subjective, right? We start making judgments. And so the system is there to level set that judgment making. And so you need that to kind of underpin the interpersonal, because you can only get so far.
And how does equity, play into this, right? Because, coming back to where we, talking about like we don't like this fundamental preferences, like to be different in terms of our preference. So how does that play out? How have you seen successful transitions or organizations or cultures play this forward, Sarah?
Well, first they have to decide that they want to change. They have to decide that having more diversity, whatever the type of diversity, is important to them, and make that case. And once they've done that, then they have to start making some systemic changes. So addressing all those levels. So number one, getting folks to think more about their own intercultural competence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that will go for the personal and the interpersonal. And then for the systems, you have to have things in place like the job architecture, the skills that go with it, the things that systematize, that give you criteria, hard and fast criteria that you can use instead of your own personal preferences. Things like this. So when you are to really get at that problem of lack of women of color and Black women at senior levels, let's just say that you got a senior position open up, and you're like, okay, here's our chance.
Mm-hmm.
We have an opportunity. So this is where you need to follow some rules. So number one, you've got to get a really diverse slate of candidates. You can't just have one Black woman on your candidate slate. Otherwise, she has statistically zero chance of being hired. She will not be hired. Mm-hmm. You have to make sure that there's diverse people on the hiring committee. There's a whole list of things that you can do, right, to make sure that it's not just how you're feeling in the moment when you do the interviews that kind of influences who you hire, right? So it's really laying out what are the criteria, what are we hiring for, and then making sure that you get a really diverse slate of candidates. So more than one.
Yeah, it's like take it seriously and get the help from professionals. I'm kind of picking the vibe up from you, Sarah. It's like,
and then also reinforce it in the organization, because a lot of times you'll have that policy in place. All right, we need diverse slates, we need this, that, the other thing, and then the hiring managers will be like, no, I don't have time for this. I got to hire someone now, and that's where you have to step in and be like, I know this is more expensive, and I know it takes more time, but this is how we meet our strategic objectives.
Yeah, this is our commitment. Yeah. And then, and maybe not for right now, but from one person of color does not make your population diverse, right? Our workforce diverse. So I think there's some interesting research just coming to me right now about the numbers or the percentages of people, like, it's like more than one. And I don't know what that particular number is, but it's the inclusive piece, so that we need to work on culture around how are we having these conversations? What is our level of safety and trust to actually have, honest conversations about how we feel and what's coming up for everybody involved in this, without kind of what's the word? The spotlight being on the person of color all the time, right? Suddenly that person is the spokesperson for their entire, the entire race. Or their gender experience. I mean, yeah. So it's too much for one person,
It's really important that you said that, because it doesn't really matter who's in your organization right now. You could be an organization of all straight white men, and you still have cultural diversity in there. There's still cultural diversity in your midst. And so start with whatever you have. Start learning how to deal with cultural difference wherever it appears in your life. That would be my advice overall, because it's a skill. It's not something you're born with. It's interesting how we're so diverse, right? But we're not born with the skill of learning to deal with cultural difference. We're born more with the skill of in groups and out groups. That's what we're born with, like my people and you people over there.
My tribe, your tribe. Yeah,
exactly. And so we have to constantly try to overcome that. And so if that's one thing I can leave you with, I think is that cultural difference is going to pop up, and it behooves you to think about how you handle cultural difference as an individual, and then how you interact with others, and then and in your organization, what's in place to help you leverage the benefits of cultural difference. Because if you don't have something in place to help you leverage the benefits, it's going to be a hindrance.
And I think a big piece I take away too, Sarah, is get over this equity piece of being unfair. And I'm thinking, and that piece around really understanding where we each come from. Like you said, even if it looks the same, there are differences. If it looks different, there are differences. And what are they? And it's kind of like in the facilitation world, we talk about your world, my world. And if we actually have the patience and care and honor and respect for each other to actually find out, like it's being like the cultural anthropologist that you are, right? Digging deep and finding out what has made us who we are and where have we come from and what have been the challenges and things. And everybody's story is different and important and needs to be valued. And then from that place, where do we need to, bringing back to your first example about the kids, right?
Yeah.
How do we actually love up and value people in our organization / our family that have different needs at different times? And can we actually deliver on those needs as and when people need them to make sure that we achieve the strategic objectives in this example of having more, colored and Black women in senior level positions throughout all companies?
Yeah, and I think it really starts with believing that that's important and understanding that how does that impact me? And for that, I go back to, and this is a little bit political, but it's also philosophical. I go back to the original identity politics, which is a scholar named Audre Lorde. You may have heard of her. And she talks about how Black women, and this is U.S. based, right? She's American. Black women are kind of at they're the ones who kind of are at the intersection of all the worst parts of society, right? They get the worst deal. They're kind of valued the least in terms of who we value in society. And I say that with great sorrow and regret. It's not something I'm happy about, right? But it's historically has been the case. And so if you solve for the Black woman, you solve for everyone.
Wow, that's a beautiful piece. That's a beautiful piece to end on.
It's very Christian too. It's what you do for the least of, you do for. I believe that. I believe it very strongly. So I believe that if you can solve problems for the folks who have the most problems, and not by their own creation, right? They're born into conditions not of their making, and we as white people, we have more power to change those conditions, and so. We shouldn't feel guilty for what our ancestors did because that's not useful. But we can recognize that we have power to change the situation. And so it starts in our minds. It starts with understanding who we are, where we come from.
Beautiful. Wow, Sarah. Wow. This is a big topic and I feel like we've only really scratched the surface. But I just want to say, thank you so much for spending your time. Sarah's based in Chicago, everyone here. And Sarah, how do people get a hold of you?
Email me.
LinkedIn? Yeah, LinkedIn.
Yeah. LinkedIn.
LinkedIn, cool. So we'll put your LinkedIn details in the show notes. So if anyone wants to reach out and find out more about what you do, that would be amazing. So as always, everybody, hopefully you've picked up a few nuggets there that either will stimulate your curiosity around embracing equity and what you can do through those three amazing lenses. And let us know how you get on, and any bit we can do, as Sarah has said to us, is important, starting with ourselves. So Emma will be back next time, and we look forward to seeing you then. Till then, remember, life's too short to have bad work stories. So reduce that suffering, and let's this week embrace, and beyond, not just this week, Sarah, embrace equity this week and beyond. All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye for now. Bye, Sarah.
Thanks for listening to Bad Work Stories Made Good with Emma and Karina. We hope you enjoyed this episode and that the perspectives we had shared stimulate your thinking and are a catalyst for your own reflections and actions. If you have a bad work story you would like to share, get in touch at help@badworkstoriesmadegood.com. And if you enjoyed or have some feedback, please leave a review. We appreciate it. Till next time, may all your bad work stories be made good.